Guadalajara province in the interior of Castile is not a landscape that announces itself. The high meseta rolls out in long, open distances, broken by limestone outcrops, and river valleys cutting through the plateau in narrow gorges, and the villages are small and widely spaced in a way reflecting both the harshness of the terrain and the long centuries during which this region was a frontier zone. Contested ground between Christian kingdoms pushing south and Moorish Al-Andalus pushing north, populated and depopulated in waves as the military tide shifted across the central plateau. Zafra Castle rises from one of those limestone outcrops above the gorge of the Linares River with a verticality and dramatic completeness that makes it one of the most striking medieval fortifications in a region not short of striking medieval fortifications. The castle dates primarily to the 12th century, when the Christian reconquest of this part of Castile was consolidating its gains, and fortified points controlling the passes and river crossings of the high meseta were a matter of immediate military practicality rather than architectural ambition. What was built at Zafra is compact and almost elemental in its form. A keep of unusual height, rising from the bare rock of the outcrop, with walls following the limestone contours in a way that makes the distinction between natural stone and dressed masonry difficult to locate at the base. The tower climbs to a height that dominates the surrounding landscape, with an effectiveness the builders clearly intended and the geology of the site readily provided. The keep's interior preserves, across its multiple levels, a spatial sequence communicating the organization of medieval tower life with a clarity that more heavily modified fortifications often lose. The lower levels, with limited openings and heavy walls, provided the storage and defensive core. The upper levels, accessible by narrow internal stairs that controlled movement through the building as deliberately as any drawbridge, offered more habitable residential spaces, whose light and air came at the cost of the vulnerability every opening in a castle wall represents. Living in a medieval tower was a continuous negotiation between comfort and security, and the architecture of Zafra makes that negotiation legible in stone at every level of the building. The strategic context connects Zafra to the broader network of fortifications that Christian kingdoms built across the high meseta during the 11th through 13th centuries, a period in which the military frontier was both a physical reality and an organizing principle of social and political life. The military orders, Calatrava, Santiago, and Alcantara among them, played a central role in this fortification program, holding and administering frontier castles in a system that combined military function with the religious and institutional structure of monastic life. Whether Zafra was held by a military order or by secular lords, at various points in its history, it existed within this broader framework and reflected its fundamental priorities. The castle has achieved international recognition. Its size and relative obscurity within Spain might not predict, owing largely to its use as a filming location for Game of Thrones, where it served as the Tower of Joy in sequences depicting a scene central to the series' backstory. That association has brought visitors to a site previously receiving little tourist attention. The heritage community's relationship to this kind of popular cultural recognition is consistently ambivalent. Increased footfall brings resources and awareness, but risks reducing a site to a single association that displaces rather than enriches its actual historical identity. The actual historical identity of Zafra Castle requires no fictional assistance. A 12th century tower fortification of high quality, preserving its structural integrity across 8 centuries in a landscape that places it in direct visual dialogue with the frontier geography that produced it, is not a site that needs dragons to justify attention. The Linar's Gorge below, the open meseta extending in every direction, the rock from which the tower rises as if the geology itself decided to build upward. These are more than sufficient. The castle is now operated as a rural hotel, which has ensured its maintenance and accessibility while raising the standard questions about heritage preservation and adaptive reuse. Sleeping in a 12th century keep above a Castilian gorge is an experience the building's original inhabitants would find unrecognizable in its comforts and entirely recognizable in its essentials. The height, the stone, the wind off the meseta, and the complete darkness that descends on a landscape with no ambient light to soften it. Cornwall occupies the southwestern tip of Britain with a geographical distinctiveness that has always set it slightly apart from the rest of England. A peninsula of granite and moorland extending into the Atlantic, with dramatic cliff and cove on both its northern and southern coasts, and an interior that retains a quality of compressed wildness, unusual for a county so close to the populated south. It was Celtic before it was English, and the memory of that pre-English identity persists in the Cornish language, in place names that resist any straightforward English etymology, and in the particular pride with which Cornish people have historically distinguished themselves from their neighbours to the east. Into this landscape, the Normans arrived after 1066 and built, as they built everywhere they consolidated power, the castles and earthworks that announced the new order. Restormel Castle, set on a wooded hill above the River Fowey near the town of Lostwithiel, is among the most geometrically perfect medieval castles that survive in England. A circular shell keep of a completeness and regularity that makes it look, from above, almost as if it was drawn with a compass. The site began as a Norman earthwork in the late 11th or early 12th century, a motte and bailey arrangement of the type the Normans deployed rapidly across conquered England before more permanent stone construction could be organized. The circular stone shell keep that replaced the earlier timber structures was built primarily in the 13th century and represents one of the best surviving examples of the shell keep form in England. A type of castle architecture in which a stone wall follows the circumference of the original motte, enclosing the summit platform within a continuous defensive ring rather than building a single central tower. The keep encloses a courtyard of impressive regularity, with the domestic ranges, great hall, solar, kitchen, chapel, arranged around the interior face of the circular wall in a layout that is, for its date and type, unusually complete. The circular plan that gives Restormel its visual distinctiveness was not purely aesthetic in its logic. A circular wall presents no corners to undermine, distributes structural stresses more evenly than a rectilinear design, and offers unobstructed sightlines along its entire inner circumference to defenders moving within the courtyard. Medieval military engineers understood the advantages of the circular form, and the consistency with which Restormel maintains that form, the keep is very nearly a perfect circle, reflects a level of planning and execution that the available labor and materials of 13th century Cornwall would have required considerable organizational effort to achieve. The castle's history is bound to the story of the Earldom of Cornwall, one of the most significant noble titles in medieval England. The earldom passed through several powerful hands before becoming a crown possession, and Restormel served at various points as a residence for the earls and their households. The most celebrated visitor was Edward the Black Prince, eldest son of Edward III, and one of the dominant military figures of the Hundred Years' War, who visited on at least 2 occasions in the mid-14th century. His presence is documented in household accounts, recording the expenses of his visits, a level of administrative detail that brings the castle's function as a working aristocratic residence into unusual clarity across the centuries. By the end of the 14th century, the castle had begun the long slide into disuse that would eventually leave it a roofless shell. The domestic ranges open to the Cornish sky, the floors and roof timbers long since gone. The Civil War of the 17th century brought a brief reactivation when parliamentary forces used it as a military base during the Cornish campaigns of 1644, but the structure was not maintained afterward and its ruination continued. What English heritage manages today is a ruin of exceptional character, walls surviving to significant height around most of the circuit, the plan of the domestic ranges clearly legible in surviving stonework, and the geometry of the whole preserved with a completeness that makes Restormel one of the more satisfying ruined castles in the English heritage canon. The wooded hill above the Fowey Valley contributes considerably to the experience of the site. Approaching through the trees and emerging at the dry moat still encircling the keep, the circular wall rising above on the summit of the motte, there is a quality of sudden visual clarity to the reveal, a geometrically resolved form in a soft and irregular landscape that makes the Norman and Plantagenet ambitions embedded in the stonework feel immediately present rather than historically remote. The Pyrenees contain, within their high passes and limestone massifs, a layer of human history that extends so far back into deep time that the categories we normally use to organize the past, ancient, medieval, modern, become almost inadequate. People have been moving through these mountains for tens of thousands of years, sheltering in their caves, hunting across their high plateaus, and leaving traces in rock that speak across the entire span of human presence in Western Europe. Harpea's cave, located in the Basque country near the Larau Pass in the French Pyrenees, belongs to this long continuum of mountain habitation, a site where prehistoric use, medieval significance, and the living traditions of the Basque people have layered themselves into a place that resists easy categorization as any one kind of heritage. The cave sits at an elevation accessible only to those willing to undertake a serious mountain walk, and that physical effort is not incidental to understanding the place. High mountain sites in the Pyrenees were not peripheral to the communities that used them. They were central, seasonally vital for transhuman herding economies moving livestock to high summer pastures, permanently important as routes of communication between communities on both sides of the range, and deeply significant in the religious and cosmological thinking of the Basque people, whose relationship to their mountain landscape is one of the defining features of their cultural identity. The prehistoric dimension of Harpea is established by engravings found within and around the cave, marks cut into rock by human hands in a period predating any written record, connecting this Pyrenean cave to the broader tradition of prehistoric rock art that makes the Franco-Cantabrian region one of the most significant areas in the world for understanding the deep history of human symbolic thought. The engravings at Harpea are not the elaborate polychrome paintings of Lascaux or Altamira, which represent the spectacular peak of that tradition. They are simpler marks, geometric forms, animal outlines, signs whose precise meaning is no longer recoverable. But they are the work of people who chose this specific location for reasons that mattered to them, and the choice of a high mountain cave suggests those reasons were not purely utilitarian. The medieval significance of Harpea connects to the cave's position along transhumance routes and pilgrimage paths crossing the Pyrenees in the centuries when the mountains were not a border, but a zone of passage between communities whose relationships ran across the range rather than stopping at it. The Basque mountain landscape was crisscrossed by these routes, and the caves along them accumulated layers of use, as waypoints, as refuges from sudden weather, as places where travelers overnighting left their marks and their prayers. Harpea shows evidence of this extended, multi-purpose use across a very long time span, with markings and deposits from different periods layered over each other in the way that genuinely ancient and continuously significant places tend to accumulate. The living Basque dimension of Harpea is perhaps its most unusual aspect, and the one most distinguishing it from a purely archaeological site. The cave figures in Basque oral tradition and in folk beliefs surrounding the figure of Basayaun, the wild lord of the forest and mountains in Basque mythology, a figure whose characteristics overlap with similar figures in other European traditions. Whether the cave's association with Basayaun is ancient or more recently shaped, it reflects the ongoing capacity of the Basque mountain landscape to carry cultural meaning across generations in ways that academic heritage categories capture only imperfectly. The Basque country has one of the most distinctive regional identities in Europe, sustained across centuries by the preservation of Euskara, a language isolate with no known relatives among the world's language families, and by cultural practices whose roots in some cases extend beyond the historical record. The mountains are not a backdrop to this culture, they are part of its substance, and sites like Harpea, where the human relationship to the Pyrenean landscape is inscribed in rock across many thousands of years, are expressions of that relationship rather than simply monuments within it. Getting to Harpea requires a mountain walk through terrain the Basque mountains provide in full, steep, beautiful, and indifferent to the preferences of anyone arriving underprepared. The cave, when reached, does not announce its significance with the apparatus of a managed heritage site. It simply exists in the mountain, as it has always existed, holding its engravings and accumulated meanings in the rock with the patience of deep time. The city of Kotor sits at the innermost point of a bay on the Adriatic coast of Montenegro that cuts so deeply into the surrounding mountains it has the quality of a fjord, steep limestone walls rising directly from the water on both sides, the bay narrowing and turning as you move inland until the city reveals itself almost as a surprise, tucked against the base of Mount Lovchen, where the mountain meets the water's edge. It is one of the more dramatically positioned cities in the Mediterranean, and the fortress climbing the mountain behind it, the fortress of St. John the Baptist, known locally as San Giovanni, is as much a feature of that drama as the bay itself. The walls ascend for roughly 4.5 kilometers, climbing from sea level to a summit fortress at nearly 300 meters, following the ridge in zigzagging curtain walls that from a distance look less like human construction than like the mountain's own geology expressed in dressed stone. Kotor's position on the Adriatic made it a place successive Mediterranean powers recognized as worth controlling and defending at considerable expense. The bay offered a sheltered deep-water anchorage, access to trade routes along the coast and through the mountain passes of the Western Balkans, and the natural advantages of a site enclosed on 3 sides by mountains and on the 4th by water. The Romans fortified here. The Byzantines maintained and expanded those works. The medieval Serbian state held and developed the position. but it was under Venetian rule, lasting with interruptions from 1420 to 1797, that the fortifications were built into the comprehensive defensive system visible today. Venice was an empire built on controlling maritime trade, and the fortification of Kotor was part of a systematic program of investment across its Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean possessions. Venetian military engineering combined the latest developments in European fortification theory with careful attention to each site's terrain, likely attack vectors, and the relationship between coastal and inland approaches. At Kotor, that meant building upward as much as outward, extending the defensive perimeter to include the mountain slopes and summit that would otherwise provide an attacker with commanding ground directly above the city. The Venetians understood the logic completely and acted on it across decades of sustained construction effort. The scale of the wall system becomes fully legible only when you begin to climb it. A path ascends through the medieval fabric of the old town, passes through successive fortified gates, and continues up the mountain face along the wall itself. The physical experience, the steepness, the changing views across the bay, the progressive revelation of how far the wall network extends across the mountain, communicates the engineering achievement more directly than any description can. The walls are not simply functional barriers. They are a declaration about the determination of the power that built them, pressed into the limestone of Mount Lovgen in courses that have survived Ottoman siege, serious earthquake, and centuries of partial neglect, with a structural integrity that speaks clearly to the standards of their original construction. The most serious test came in 1657, when an Ottoman force besieged Kotor and was repelled. That success is attributed in local tradition to the intercession of the Virgin Mary on the feast of her Nativity, an event the city still commemorates each year with a procession of considerable civic significance. Whether the devotional interpretation or the quality of the fortifications deserves primary credit for the Ottoman failure is a theological question rather than an archaeological one. The walls themselves make their contribution plain. The Ottomans, who had taken most of the Balkans and would eventually take Venice's other significant Adriatic possessions, never took Kotor. The old town and its fortifications were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979, recognizing a medieval urban fabric preserved within its Venetian defensive walls with a completeness unusual anywhere in the Adriatic region. An earthquake struck the same year and caused significant damage, and the restoration effort that followed was large in scale and, by the judgment of most professionals who have evaluated it, successful in preserving the essential character of the medieval core. Climbing to the summit fortress at dusk, when the bay fills with reflected light and the limestone walls move from orange to gray as the sun descends behind the western mountains, the full logic of what 15 centuries of successive builders created here becomes briefly and completely legible. The mountain, the water, the walls, and the city they enclose are one system. Every layer of construction added to it understood that, and the understanding shows. The Monts de la Corne form the southern edge of the Massif Central in the Tarn department of southern France, a landscape of rounded granite summits, high moorland pasture, and deep river valleys that has been inhabited since the Neolithic without ever concentrating the population or external attention that lower, richer landscapes tend to receive. It is a quietly persistent place, not dramatic in the way that volcanic peaks to the north or the limestone gorges of the Cevennes to the east are dramatic, but possessed of a steady and austere beauty that rewards the visitor who arrives without expecting the picturesque. Near the town of Murat-sur-Vèbre sits Peyro Clabado, a name translating from the local Occitan as the nailed stone or the pinned stone. A large granite boulder balanced on a much smaller natural pedestal of rock in a way that looks, at first encounter, less like a geological phenomenon than a deliberate act of truly impossible engineering. Peyro Clabado is a rocking stone, or Logan stone, a naturally balanced rock that the specific conditions of its geological history have produced in such precise equilibrium that it can, with relatively modest force applied at the correct point, be made to move. The granite of the Mont de la Corne was shaped by freeze-thaw processes over the millennia following the last glaciation, with water penetrating the natural joints in the rock and the repeated cycling between freezing and thawing progressively splitting and rounding the boulders that erosion had exposed on the high ground. Peyro Clabado is the result of this process operating with unusual precision, a boulder of several tons balanced on a smaller pedestal at a contact point so minimal that the equilibrium it maintains seems to defy the casual expectations of gravity. Rocking stones are found across the granite uplands of Western Europe, in Cornwall, in Brittany, in Galicia, in the granite massifs of the Iberian Peninsula and France, and they appear in the folklore of communities near them with a consistency suggesting their impact on human imagination has been broadly similar across different cultures and periods. In many cases, the rocking motion was attributed to supernatural causation, the stones understood as responding to the presence of innocence or guilt, to sacred ritual, or to the will of a deity whose influence could be read in whether the stone moved or held still. Whether Peyro Clabado carried this kind of significance for the prehistoric or early medieval communities of the Monts de la Corne is not documented, but the pattern of such attribution elsewhere is consistent enough that its absence from the local record more likely reflects the thinness of that record than any actual absence of significance at the time. The Occitan name itself implies a long history of human awareness of the stone's peculiar character. To name something the pinned stone, the stone that appears held in place by a nail whose balance resists simple explanation, is to register the cognitive impact of encountering it, to acknowledge that this rock requires a name precisely because it is not simply a rock. The toponymy of the granite uplands of southern France is full of names for unusual natural features that encode the observations of successive generations that a particular place is worth noting and worth transmitting. Peyro Clabado is one of those observations, given permanence in language as the stone itself was given permanence in granite by the long, indifferent patience of the freeze and thaw. The broader landscape includes other features of the granite moorland worth attention, outcrops shaped by the same processes that produced Peyro Clabado, traces of ancient pastoral activity in the form of clearance cairns and former field boundaries, and the general texture of a high upland landscape used by human communities for farming and grazing since at least the Neolithic period. The Monts de la Corne do not offer the density of formal prehistoric monuments that the more celebrated megalithic regions of France provide, but they preserve in their landscape the evidence of long human occupation in forms that require some attentiveness to read correctly. Peyro Clabado is accessible on foot and receives a modest and mostly local flow of visitors who come to see the balanced rock and, conditions permitting, to attempt the rocking themselves. The experience of actually moving several tons of granite by hand, of confirming with your own body that the physics which the stone's appearance makes improbable are entirely real, is consistently reported as more striking than visitors expected. The stone moves, the equilibrium holds, and the massive central delivers one of its quieter but most genuinely surprising moments. Tajikistan is a country most people in the Western world could not locate on a map with confidence, and yet the territory it occupies sits at one of the great historic crossroads of the ancient and medieval world, where Silk Road routes converged, where Iranian and Turkic cultural spheres met the influence of India and China, and where Alexander the Great pushed his armies into territory that even his veterans found improbably remote. Hisor, sometimes transliterated as Hisar, is a small city about 20 kilometers west of the Tajik capital Dushanbe, and the fortress dominating it from a natural hillock above the surrounding plain is one of the most historically layered sites in a country where the entire territory is layered in this way. The walls visible today are largely 18th and 19th century reconstruction over much older foundations, and what they enclose extends back through Timurid, Mongol, Samanid, and earlier occupation to a position that human communities have recognized and used for at least 2,500 years. The Hisor Valley was in the medieval period one of the principal settled zones of what is now Tajikistan, a fertile agricultural basin fed by mountain rivers from the surrounding Pamir and Hisar ranges, positioned on trade routes connecting Samarkand and Bukhara to the west, with mountain passes toward India and China to the east. The fortress commanded that position with the directness that elevated ground over productive agricultural plain always provides, and the successive powers controlling the region. The Samanid dynasty of the 9th and 10th centuries, the Mongol successor states, the Timurids, the Bukharan Emirate, each recognized Hisor as worth maintaining and defending. The architectural accretions of that long sequence are built into the site in layers the eye can read at the surface, while the full stratigraphic complexity remains to be excavated. The most visible surviving structure is the main gate, or Darvazakona, a twin-towered entrance portal of considerable scale built in the 18th century under the Bukharan Emirate. The circular towers flanking the gate rise to crenellated parapets, and the brickwork reflects the technical traditions of Central Asian military architecture that had been developing in the region since at least the medieval period. The gate opens onto an interior plateau where the administrative and residential buildings of the complex once stood, now reduced to foundations and earthworks that archaeology has begun to interpret, but not yet fully mapped. Beyond the gate, looking back across the valley toward the mountains defining the southern horizon, the strategic logic of the position is immediate and complete. The site also contains 2 madrasas, Islamic institutions of religious education, whose remains show the fortress's function not only as a military and administrative center, but as a focus of religious and intellectual life. The presence of educational institutions within the fortress reflects the Central Asian pattern, in which political, military, and religious authority were organized in close spatial proximity, the fortress providing security for institutions that legitimized the power it embodied. One of the madrasas preserves its entrance portal and portions of its facade with sufficient completeness to convey the quality of the original construction, and surviving fragments of carved terracotta and glazed tile provide evidence of the decorative ambition the Bukharan Emirate brought even to its provincial centers. A caravanserai within the complex speaks to the trade function alongside the military and administrative ones. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a network maintained by caravanserais, way stations providing shelter, water, fodder, and security for merchants at intervals of roughly a day's travel. And the presence of one at Hisor places the fortress within this commercial geography as clearly as the madrasa places it within the religious one. The fortress controlled the valley, taxed the trade, educated the functionaries, and organized the religious life of the surrounding population. All of these functions are legible at the site simultaneously. Hisor Fortress was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017 as part of a broader inscription covering Tajikistan's Silk Road heritage. That recognition brought international attention to a site previously known primarily to specialists and travelers willing to venture beyond standard post-Soviet tourism routes. The fortress is accessible from Dushanbe in under an hour, and the combination of the surviving gate, the madrasa remains, the caravanserai, and the views across the valley toward the Pamir foothills makes it one of the more rewarding excursions available from any Central Asian capital. Northumberland, in the far north of England, carries its prehistoric past close to the surface in a way that more densely populated parts of Britain do not. The landscape is wide and sparsely settled. The moorland rolls uninterrupted between the Roman wall to the south and the Scottish border to the north, and the standing stones, cup and ring-marked outcrops, and cairns left by Neolithic and Bronze Age communities sit in the open without fences or interpretation boards, preserved by the thinness of subsequent settlement rather than by deliberate heritage policy. The Great Stone of Fourstones, a large glacial erratic standing near the village of Fourstones in the South Tyne Valley, belongs to this landscape of quiet and unannounced prehistory. A single massive stone in an agricultural field that has accumulated across the centuries a weight of local tradition and archaeological speculation entirely disproportionate to its apparent simplicity. The stone is a substantial sandstone boulder, not quarried or transported by human effort, but deposited by glacial action during the last ice age at a point in the landscape that, by accident or by the later recognition of that presence by human communities, became a focus of significance. Its dimensions make it conspicuous in its setting, large enough to read as a landmark from a distance across the valley, and imposing enough at close quarters to explain why it attracted the attention of successive generations who encountered it in the field. Whether the stone was ever worked, erected in a more upright position, or deliberately modified in any way is a question the physical evidence does not answer clearly, since glacial erratics and intentionally placed prehistoric monoliths can be difficult to distinguish without excavation evidence drawn from the surrounding ground. The name Fourstones itself is the most historically tantalizing element of the site's story. A place name incorporating a numeral and the word stones almost inevitably invites the question of what the four stones were, since a single large erratic does not account for the plurality the name implies. Local and antiquarian tradition has proposed various explanations over the years: that additional stones once stood nearby and have since been removed or buried, that the name refers to a group of standing stones of which only one now survives, that the reference is to four boundary markers of a different kind, perhaps medieval, perhaps earlier. None of these explanations has been confirmed by excavation, and the documentary record for the name does not extend back far enough to settle the question from historical evidence alone. Antiquarian interest in the stone dates at least to the 18th century, when scholars beginning to catalogue the prehistoric monuments of northern England noted it in their regional surveys. That tradition of local documentation, though it has not produced the systematic excavation that would clarify the stone's relationship to any broader prehistoric monument complex, has at least established a record of the stone's appearance and setting across 2 centuries, enough to assess what has and has not changed in its immediate environment. The surrounding fields have been cultivated, and boundaries have shifted in the ways that agricultural land is always modified. But the stone itself occupies the same position in the same field that the early antiquarians described. The South Tyne Valley was a significant corridor of movement and settlement in both the prehistoric and Roman periods. The road and supply infrastructure associated with Hadrian's Wall passes through the region, and the density of prehistoric sites across the moorland above the valley suggests a landscape actively used and settled across the full sweep of the period during which Britain's prehistoric monuments were built. A large and conspicuous stone in the floor of this valley, whether deliberately incorporated into a monument complex or simply recognized as a natural landmark by communities moving through, would have been a persistent feature of that landscape that successive generations encountered and gave meaning to in their own terms. What the Great Stone of Fourstones offers the visitor willing to find it is not dramatic spectacle, but a quieter kind of encounter with an object that has occupied this field since before the last ice retreated, that people have been naming and telling stories about for at least 1,000 years, and whose full significance that accumulation of stories and centuries has not yet resolved. Northumberland's prehistoric landscape is full of such encounters, and they have a cumulative effect on the attentive visitor that the more heavily documented and managed sites sometimes, despite all their interpretive clarity, cannot quite achieve. The Anatolian Plateau of central Turkey is a landscape of volcanic geology and vast horizontal distances, where the land rises and falls in long swells and where evidence of human occupation across several millennia sits close to the surface in a density the sparse contemporary population does not prepare you for. Konya province was among the most productive agricultural zones of the ancient world, and a corridor through which the civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Near East, and the Iranian Plateau made contact across centuries of trade and cultural exchange. The ancient city of Kilistra, located on and within a volcanic rock formation about 40 kilometers southwest of Konya, is one of the less visited sites in this richly layered landscape. A place whose combination of rock-cut architecture, early Christian history, and natural geology rewards the effort of reaching it with a quality of encounter that more managed sites in the region cannot replicate. Kilistra's most visually striking feature is the rock itself. The site occupies an outcrop of volcanic tuff, the same soft, easily worked stone that permitted the extraordinary underground cities and carved churches of Cappadocia to the northeast, and the community that lived here exploited that workability with systematic thoroughness. Chambers, cisterns, passageways, and niches are cut directly into the rock at multiple levels, with the natural topography of the outcrop organizing a settlement that expanded into the stone, rather than simply sitting on top of it. The relationship between natural formation and human intervention is genuinely difficult to disentangle at close quarters. The rock has been shaped, and the shaping has been so thoroughly absorbed into the formation's appearance that the two seem to have arrived at their current state together. The historical record for Kilistra is fragmentary in the way typical of secondary Anatolian sites, enough to establish a broad chronological framework, not enough to supply specific narrative. The settlement appears to have been occupied through the Hellenistic and Roman periods, with the rock-cut architecture reflecting accumulated work across those centuries. The most significant historical connection links Kilistra to the early Christian period, and specifically to the missionary travels of Paul of Tarsus, whose journeys through central Anatolia in the 1st century AD established communities that became the foundation of Christianity's institutional presence in Asia Minor. Whether Paul passed through Kilistra itself, or only through the surrounding region, the evidence does not settle, but the early Christian material at the site is substantial and suggests a community engaged with the new faith from an early date. The rock-cut churches are among the most compelling elements of the site, carved into the tuff with the combination of functional practicality and decorative intention characteristic of early Christian communities throughout Asia Minor. Those communities used volcanic tuff as a resource for sacred spaces that could be cut quickly, enlarged as congregations grew, and concealed during persecution. The plasticity of the rock serving spiritual and institutional needs in a political environment that was, until the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, actively hostile to their existence. The churches at Kilistra preserve remnants of painted decoration, carved architectural details, and spatial arrangements connecting them to the broader tradition of rock-cut Christian architecture extending across central Anatolia. Above the rock-cut levels, surface ruins include remains of above-ground construction in the characteristic rubble masonry of late antique Anatolia. Column fragments, architectural elements, and foundations of structures that constituted the public face of the settlement, while the carved spaces served its more private and protected functions. The combination of above-ground and below-ground construction illustrates a pattern common to Anatolian settlements of the Roman and early Christian periods, in which rock was used for storage, refuge, and sacred use, while the surface accommodated the commercial and civic life of the community. The site receives very limited formal archaeological attention and no tourist infrastructure, which means Kilistra remains in a state of openness that most comparable sites in Turkey no longer offer. The volcanic outcrop, the carved chambers, the ruined surface structures, and the wide agricultural plateau extending in every direction present themselves without interpretation panels or entrance fees, in a condition closer to discovery than to display. For the visitor willing to navigate 40 kilometers of increasingly minor roads southwest of Konya, that condition is precisely the point. The Yucatan Peninsula is a limestone shelf extending into the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, flat and porous, with no rivers running across its surface because the water sinks straight through the rock into underground channels and cenotes, the natural sinkholes that provided the Maya with their primary water source across centuries of civilization. It is a landscape offering few of the obvious geographical advantages that other great civilizations built upon, and the cities the Maya constructed across it are correspondingly remarkable for what they achieved without rivers, metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals. Uxmal in the Puyuk Hills of the southwestern Yucatan is one of the most beautiful of those cities, a major center of the Terminal Classic period, roughly 700 to 1000 AD, and the finest surviving expression of the Puyuk architectural style, distinguishing the cities of this region from Maya architecture elsewhere. The Puyuk style takes its name from the low hill range, Puyuk means hills in Yucatec Maya, on whose slopes and summits these cities were built, and it is distinguished above all by its treatment of building facades. The lower portions are typically plain, faced with precisely cut limestone veneer blocks fitted without mortar. The upper portions, above the medial molding dividing the facade horizontally, are covered in elaborate mosaic decoration assembled from thousands of individually carved stone elements. Geometric lattices, long-nosed Chak masks stacked at corners and doorways, serpent bodies, feathered motifs, composed into surfaces of extraordinary visual complexity and technical precision. The contrast between plain lower wall and decorated upper registers creates a rhythm that photographs cannot fully capture because the carved elements change with the sun's angle in ways that animate the facade throughout the day. The Pyramid of the Magician, rising at the entrance to the main ceremonial precinct, is the structure most visitors encounter first and remember most distinctly. Its plan is not a square, but an oval, almost unique among Maya pyramids, giving the structure a silhouette that reads as organic and rounded rather than geometric and angular. It was built in multiple stages over several centuries, each phase encasing the previous structure in a larger outer shell, so that the current building contains the architectural history of the site compressed into a single limestone mass. The steepness of its sides and the height of its staircase give it a vertical drama that the flatter profiles of some Maya pyramids do not achieve. The Governor's Palace, which many architectural historians consider the single greatest pre-Columbian building in Mesoamerica, sits on a large artificial terrace across the precinct. The argument for that assessment rests on the combination of scale, proportion, and decorative refinement the building achieves simultaneously, a combination that individually impressive buildings often fail to maintain across all three. The facade extends nearly 100 meters and carries a mosaic frieze of approximately 20,000 individually carved stone elements depicting celestial symbolism, Venus glyphs, and long-nosed deity masks running as a continuous narrative across the full width. The alignment of the central doorway with the southernmost rising point of Venus as a morning star has been confirmed by archaeoastronomical analysis, suggesting the orientation was precisely calibrated to the astronomical cycles the Maya tracked with an accuracy that continues to impress researchers. The nunnery quadrangle, named by the Spanish, who saw in its arrangement a resemblance to a convent, though the actual function was almost certainly administrative or ceremonial, is a four-building enclosure around a central courtyard, each building carrying a different decorative program on its upper facade. The variety within the stylistic unity of the Puyuk vocabulary across the four buildings is one of its most instructive features. The same architectural language inflected differently on each facade, demonstrating the expressive range available within a tradition often described as purely formal. Uxmal was abandoned before the Spanish arrival, its precise end date and causes subjects of continuing archaeological discussion. The Puyuk cities as a group appear to have been depopulated during the 10th century, possibly through drought in a region always vulnerable to water scarcity, possibly through political collapse, possibly both. The buildings left standing were left completely. No systematic stripping of materials, no partial demolition, simply the cessation of maintenance and the slow work of the jungle across the centuries that followed. UNESCO recognized the site in 1996. The sound and light show that plays on the Pyramid of the Magician each evening is entirely optional. The Chola dynasty ruled much of southern India from the 9th to the 13th century AD, and the temples they built represent one of the great sustained achievements in the history of religious architecture. Three of those temples, at Thanjavur, Gangaikonda Cholapuram, and Dharasuram, are grouped as the Great Living Chola Temples on the UNESCO World Heritage List, a designation reflecting both their exceptional architectural quality and the fact that they remain active places of Hindu worship rather than purely archaeological monuments. The Airavatesvara Temple at Darasuram, built in the 12th century during the reign of Rajaraja II, is in some respects the least celebrated of the three, smaller than the Great Brihadeeswara at Thanjavur, and less discussed in popular literature on South Indian temple architecture. It is also, in the judgment of many specialists who have studied all three carefully, the most densely packed with sculptural invention and narrative detail. A building whose every surface was treated as an opportunity the craftsmen who worked it were not prepared to leave unrealized. The temple is dedicated to Shiva, worshipped here as Airavatesvara, a name derived from Airavata, the white elephant of the god Indra, who, according to Hindu legend, worshipped at this site after being cursed by the sage Durvasa and seeking restoration of his divine nature. The mythological framework surrounding the temple's foundation is characteristic of Chola religious architecture, in which the historical and the cosmological are woven together so that the built structure simultaneously records royal piety and models the divine geography it was constructed to honor. The plan of the Airavatesvara Temple follows the standard Dravidian temple layout, a principal shrine tower over the sanctum sanctorum, a pillared mandapa in front, subsidiary shrines, enclosure walls, but executes that plan with a degree of elaboration in the detailing that makes the term standard feel insufficient. The outer walls of the mandapa are divided into horizontal registers of sculptural work representing some of the finest stone carving produced anywhere in India during the medieval period. The figures, deities, attendants, celestial musicians, mythological narratives drawn from Shaivite and Vaishnavite traditions, scenes from the Puranas, are carved in a style combining the formal conventions of the Chola sculptural tradition with an attention to individual expression and movement that gives the best figures a quality of arrested life rather than frozen ceremony. The pillared mandapa includes a feature unusual enough to deserve specific attention: the chariot steps. The front of the mandapa is designed to resemble a massive stone chariot, complete with wheels, similar in concept to the better-known chariot temple at Konark in Odisha, though predating it, with the staircase rising between carved stone wheels of considerable scale and refinement. The horses that would conventionally draw such a chariot are present in carved form at the base of the steps. The effect is of a divine vehicle in permanent arrested motion, having arrived at the temple and stopped at the threshold between the world of the worshipper and the world of the deity within. The Chola sculptural program extends to the mandapa interior, where pillar surface carving achieves a density and consistency that sustained examination rewards. Miniature figures on pillar shafts, narrative panels in wall niches, decorative molding vocabulary, all of this reflects an organizational intelligence operating across the entire building simultaneously, ensuring that the sculptural program coheres as a theological statement while accommodating multiple teams of craftsmen working across the construction period. Rajaraja II, under whose patronage the temple was built, ruled during a period when Chola political power was beginning the decline that would accelerate in the following century. But the resources and craft traditions available to the building program at Darasuram show no sign of that political contraction. The quality is consistent with the greatest Chola campaigns of the preceding 2 centuries, and the ambition of the sculptural program, the quantity and variety of imagery deployed across every available surface, reflects a patronage that understood temple construction as an ongoing investment in the divine relationship that royal legitimacy depended upon. Dharasuram is a small town in the Thanjavur district of Tamil Nadu, and the temple receives a fraction of the visitors who make the journey to the Brihadiswara 40 kilometers away. That disproportion is the visitor's advantage. The Airavatesvara Temple can be walked slowly, its sculptural surfaces examined at the proximity they reward, without the management pressures attendance at the more famous site requires. In the desert of northern Iraq, roughly halfway between Mosul and the Syrian border, the ruins of Hatra occupy a circular walled enclosure on a flat plain that offers no natural defensive advantages of any kind. No river to protect a flank, no elevated ground to command the approaches, no cliff or gorge to complicate assault. What Hatra had instead was walls. Massive, carefully engineered, reinforced with towers at close intervals. And behind those walls, one of the most extraordinary hybrid cities of the ancient world, simultaneously Parthian and Arab, worshipping gods from the Greek, Mesopotamian, and Arabian pantheons within a single sacred precinct, and twice repelling the armies of Rome at the height of that empire's military power. The desert gave it nothing. It built everything itself. Hatra flourished roughly between the 1st century BC and 240 AD, functioning as the capital of a semi-independent Arab kingdom within the broader orbit of the Parthian Empire. Its position on the caravan routes between Mesopotamia and Syria gave it considerable commercial importance, and the combination of Parthian political protection and local Arab dynastic rule gave it an autonomy unusual for a city of its size and wealth. The kings of Hatra styled themselves lords of the Arabs and minted their own coins, and the city they ruled was dense with temples, colonnaded streets, and monumental architecture. Not a trading post or garrison town, but a genuine urban center with the resources and ambition to express itself fully in stone. The architecture of Hatra is among the most important surviving examples of Parthian building, and it expresses a cultural fusion with no single clear precedent. The great sanctuary at the heart of the city was organized around a series of iwan, large vaulted halls open on one end that became one of the defining architectural forms of the Iranian world. Deployed at Hatra on a scale and with decorative elaboration that influenced subsequent Islamic architecture across a wide region. The combination of Iranian structural forms with Hellenistic sculptural vocabulary, Mesopotamian religious iconography, and Arab cultic tradition created an architectural language wholly its own, recognizable as Hatrine in a way that nothing else quite is. The statuary recovered from Hatra's temples is among the most remarkable to survive from any ancient Near Eastern city. Figures of gods, kings, and priests rendered in a style blending Hellenistic naturalism with the frontal, hieratic quality of Near Eastern religious art carry an intensity that ancient sculpture rarely conveys so directly. The gods worshipped at Hatra came from across the region. Shamash, the sun god, Nergal, lord of the underworld, the Syrian goddess Atargatis, and a local supreme deity known as Maran, lord. Reflecting the religious pragmatism of a city standing at the intersection of multiple civilizations whose commercial survival depended partly on accommodating the spiritual needs of travelers and merchants from many different backgrounds. The two Roman sieges of Hatra are among the most instructive episodes in the military history of the ancient Near East. The Emperor Trajan, at the peak of his military reputation following his Dacian campaigns, besieged the city in 116 AD and failed to take it. Septimius Severus besieged it twice, in 198 and 199 AD, with armies specifically equipped for extended siege operations. He also failed. Both times, the walls held. Roman siege engineering that had overcome Jerusalem and Masada could not overcome a desert city on a flat plain with nothing but its walls to defend it. Hatra outlasted the greatest military power of its era through the simple excellence of its construction. The city fell not to Rome, but to the Sassanid Persian Empire, which succeeded the Parthians as the dominant power of the Iranian plateau and took Hatra around 240 AD. The city was not rebuilt after that conquest. What survived into the modern period was extraordinary in its extent and quality, enough to earn UNESCO World Heritage status in 1985 and to make Hatra one of the principal archaeological sites of Iraq, studied by generations of scholars and visited by travelers willing to make the journey to the northern desert. In 2015, forces of the Islamic State entered Hatra and systematically destroyed what they found, using sledgehammers, drills, and explosives on statuary and architectural elements that had survived 2,000 years in the desert air. The documentation of that destruction, filmed and released by the perpetrators, was watched by archaeologists and historians around the world with a grief that circumstances made almost impossible to express adequately. What Trajan and Septimius Severus could not take with their armies, ideology took with hand tools in an afternoon. The walls of Hatra still stand. Much of what they once protected does not. 11 sites, 11 civilizations that carved, stacked, climbed, and committed to stone with a seriousness that puts almost everything we casually call permanent to shame. From the geometric perfection of Chanbauri's desert staircase to the Telem dead resting in cliff-face caves above the Malian plain. What connects all of it isn't mystery for its own sake. It's the stubborn human insistence on leaving something behind that outlasts the person who made it. Most of these places still have unanswered questions sitting in their foundations, unexcavated chambers, undeciphered inscriptions, sections of wall that nobody has touched in 1,000 years. Which means the story isn't finished, not even close. There is a 12th site in this series, one that may reframe how we think about several of the others, a place where multiple ancient traditions appear to converge in ways that current archaeology is only beginning to map. That one comes next. If this series is something you want to see continue, subscribing to the channel is the most direct way to make that happen. It costs nothing, and it means a great deal. We'll see you at the next site.